Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. This one I'm going to be walking through the space padded material I did. I thought it'd be an interesting one because this is one where I was experimenting with Marvelous Designer. After learning a thing or two from my previous material, which was at the time the space hatch, I wanted to explore a few different ways of doing stuff. Before we get in, I wanted to explain. The time this video goes out, there's also going to be an experience points article. It'll be just a sort of a written version of this tutorial with a few questions asked, which I can answer. Just wanted to let you guys know that this is going to be sort of a dual launch type thing. But with this material, I want to give a bit of context to why I created it. So with the previous material, which is this space hatch, the fabric created in the corners, Chala Cruz helped me work it out in the Dynasty chat, how to achieve this type of effect, purely in Designer. Now I wanted to do another material, which was Paul Pepper's these sort of padded bags with the straps going across them. But I thought it'd be a good time. I've always wanted to learn Designer, Marvelous Designer. So I thought this was a good time to like sort of pick that up, figure it out a little bit so that I could incorporate it into my Substance Designer graph to help achieve this material. The idea originally came from James Watosa. I remember he did some fantastic sort of space padded materials, so I was checking out his stuff, and it's when he actually mentioned in one of these materials he created this using Marvelous Designer. And that's where the idea originally came from. I saw James do this, and it was super effective. So I thought I'd try with this one. So what I'm going to do is walk through my project from Marvelous Designer, how I took it into Zbrush, and then what I did in Substance Designer. Let's jump straight in. I'll preference this with this isn't like this is how you use Marvelous Designer. This was what I achieved just sort of messing around, creating some bits. So if you're familiar with Marvelous, you know you create your sort of patterns here. So with this material, I've got this frame here. I've got this square piece which is attached to the bottom. Reason being is with Designer you can have the fabric simulate either like positive or negative gravity. So like it sort of puffs up like a bag, or it can like contract to a material. So in order to get it to puff out the way I wanted it to, I use this red square to attach to the bottom of this frame. Just means that when I apply the simulation, it doesn't sort of fly off into space. There's nothing too crazy going on here. This main panel, which is this top piece, is longer and wider than these side pieces to give it that sort of all these extra creases. And I added some elastic on the pattern to contract, and I can control how powerful this contraction is. And you can see on the side here, got the elastic, I've turned it on, and I can control the strength and how long the segment is. That's all I really want to talk about with Marvelous. Like I said, I'm not proficient in this. There's probably easier ways of achieving this effect. I'm not aware of. This was just me experimenting. So what I did with this, I created 4 iterations. And exported all 4 into Zbrush. So within Zbrush, so you can see this is one where it has 2 straps, and if I just go through, this is one with 2 straps but it's really tight, one with 1 strap but it's a little bit baggier, and then another single strap just to make it a little bit different from the previous ones. You can see this one doesn't have any of the detail around here, this one does. These are the raw exports out of Marvelous Designer, so you can see they're a bit faceted. This can be fixed easily, a couple of sub-Ds, some smoothing, and I think I went in and just exaggerated a few shapes. But then with all of these, let's come across to here, to alpha, go to, if it stays, go to transfer, grab dock, and this will basically save out the height map of this bag. Did that 4 times. So that's all of our time in in the external stuff. There's nothing crazy going on. This is super simple. It's just a quick way to achieve a certain effect. So I take them into Designer. So I've got my 4 height maps here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So they came out pretty clean. These just give me a basis to work off. I still go in and modify them. But you can see in my graph is I broke this up into pieces. So I have, you know, the top layer, which is this. So you can see this is my height information. This was my roughness. This is my metallic. And this is my albedo. And they all sort of come together. But within there, I've made the buckles for the straps. I've made my modifications to bag 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's a graph for the graphical stamp that goes on each bag. So we'll just start with bag 1. There's no point diving into this bit yet without first going through all this. So, view output, no, it's in 3D. So here's the sort of end result of the bag. You can see I've got this graphical stamp. I've got these like rubbery straps. If I just bring the reference back up, you can see these straps here. They, in the reference, it looked like to me they have like they're more rubbery rather than like shiny plastic or fabric. So they have a little bit of roughness information, but not a great deal. There's the buckle. So I'm going to use the deep preview node again because I think it's a good way to walk through the graph. Again, I'll link the tutorial to Daniel Tiger's courses. This is where I got this node from. It's a really useful node. This helps sort of show what I'm doing. Let's just turn the height amount up a little bit. Turn to 1. Okay, so this is my bitmap image. I just centered it up a bit better, and I used the Daniel Tiger directional warp, although you don't need to use that now because Designer's implemented its own multi-directional warp. But it's just to give the bag a little bit more variation so it isn't so smooth, the edges. And then I go in and basically what I do for each bag is I just exaggerate shapes. So with this part, I've gone in and I've used the same technique which Chala showed me, which is using a multi-directional warp, Perler noise via Perler noise, directional warp again by the original shape and blur it, and then I just subtract it away from the original. This looks quite drastic here. It gets sort of tidied up a bit later on. Now it's the micro detail. So again, I'll use this deep directional warp. Like now the Designer have got their own, you wouldn't use this one. But again, every noise I always sort of do a multi-directional warp via the original shape. It just helps the detail actually go with the curves and the details of the original. Without this, it can sometimes look like you're just stamping shapes on top of each other. So took microfibers, directional warp them, and blended them on top. You can't really see, I don't think you'll be able to see that detail too well, but it's this subtle. Just breaks up at the smoothness because these are some rough canvas bags. So I wanted to add a little bit of micro detail in there. The main important one was this mesh texture. This was really useful because it just basically gave me exactly what I was looking for in terms of giving it that canvas detail. So you can see these bags, they're really, really rough. They're not like smooth plastic or silicone or anything like that. So that's why I ended up applying all this detail. Yeah, I inverted it, gave it the directional warp. Again, you can see in here it's just the mesh detail sort of warps and changes based on the original shape, and it means that when I apply the detail, it just feels a bit better. There's a few artifacts here and there, but it just makes overall that detail feel a bit more realistic. So now it's making the belt detail. So where the belts actually sit, you can see if I just show you the 2D view, there's one, there's the other. So there's a few things I have to do here in terms of actually fixing it, because when I originally had the belt, the underlying sort of detail of the bag wasn't sort of set back enough for the belt to feel natural, so I had to go back and fix that later on. But yeah, took the shape, beveled it, positioned it the way I wanted to. I gave it a blur, and I subtract. This is what I'm talking about. I'm saying I had to sort of, originally what I did is I made the belt without this stage, made the belt, applied it, and basically the belt wasn't sort of height blending the way I wanted it to, so I had to go back and fix it in here. So you can see I've just subtracted sort of the blurred version of the belt away from the original shape, just so that when I height blend, the belt actually comes through the way I want it to. As for the actual belt itself, I blended a gradient on top just to give it the sort of curve that the bag has. Use levels to control it. Just position it more. I didn't end up using this detail. I was going to add like I didn't use it in this one. I think I used it in the other graphs, but basically, if I apply it, let's see what I mean. It's just to give like a bit of horizontal dip to it. You can see more down here where like the edge is slightly lighter. So let's apply the belt. So you can see what it does is it sort of just tucks it in the middle as well. So the belt isn't like, has both a sort of horizontal curve and a sort of vertical curve. I don't know why I would have turned it off. That might be I've just left that on in the graph. Yeah, that's the horizontal belt, and then I'll repeat the stage again. I'll just copy and paste that whole graph and just change the original shape to be horizontal instead. Do the exact same, blur it, subtract it away from the original, so it gives, you can see how much of a difference that one made. Read the same steps again, so add the gradient to follow the curve of the bag, add the sort of horizontal subtraction. It means when I plug this in, that's the bag with the straps now. As for the buckle, actually probably best to walk through that graph now. So if I open reference, I made this in a separate graph just to keep it tidy, so I was going to be reusing this buckle a lot. It's nothing particularly special. It is a shape. Use a transform node to cut the corners. Could have used a mirror really here. I didn't need to do this twice. See, this is a funny thing. When I come back and looking at these graphs, I'm realizing like now I've done this a bit more with the stylized stuff. There's much better ways of doing some of this. But yeah, I've chamfered the corners essentially, and then taken sections out of each side, using edge detect to give me a sort of an outline, using a transform just to sort of stretch it into shape, cutting the bottom off, shrinking it down. And the reason I'm cutting the bottom off is because I think I'm going to get rid of it in the end, because that's where the belt actually goes over. I'll copy this section of the graph just without the flip, just get the chamfer corners, take the top off, blend, just to make sure. So these are the two sides of the buckle where the strap goes over and under. These are the sort of rollers that you have on the buckle, so that they're a lot smoother, so this allows the strap to sort of move through a bit smoother. So these bits are the hard, like square shaped ones. These are the actual rollers which allow things to roll through the buckle. Again, it's nothing crazy. It's a gradient node of a curve to give me the sort of profile I wanted, and it's transformed just to be in the different positions I need, and then blend it in. Yeah, and I go back and I use a subtract node to just clean up certain areas. But that's the buckle. There's nothing special. It's just a load of transform nodes subtracting away from each other. Go back to the bag. So the buckle I transform to make it a lot smaller, and I basically create a mask using histogram scan, and it's just a copy straight over the top. So where the bag is at the moment is here. View outputs. So you can see now it's just copied on top. It's not crazy detailed because I knew I was going to be scaling these bags down quite a lot for the material. There's not as much detail in there as there probably could be. That was a conscious decision. I could have gone in and made it a far more detailed buckle, or made the transitions between the two a lot nicer. The only reason I decided not to is because I knew that it was going to get shrunk down a lot. I mean, even in the booklet itself, there's probably a bit too much detail in this, really, and it's like a 1024 image. I could have made that like a 512, even 2046 if I wanted to. Looking back now, like I said, there's a lot of stuff I probably would do differently for efficiency's sake. But because it's a subgraph, I'll put into a false invert and just spit into my normal map, my ambient occlusion, and these are my outputs. Just to look at the albedo, again, it's just a lot of noises blended into each other. I made this graphic quickly in Designer. I wasn't making Photoshop, but the time it would take me to open Photoshop and make it, I just made it in Designer instead. Again, there's nothing particularly crazy going on. Some text nodes, transformed, blended together, took a shape and transformed it and did an edge detect to give me a frame, positioned the two elements. I needed to just fill this box with some text, so I just rambled in there because you're never going to be able to read it. So just some complete nonsense. Grabbed a couple of Chinese characters because I think in the reference, yeah, you can see there's some sort of Chinese characters. I don't know what they said, and that's as well. I've got the sort of composition for the graphic idea with the sort of center label, a brand logo, and some Chinese text. But yeah, some rambly text, some Chinese logos, and that's my graphic I used. So I took some cloud noises. Again, like I said, I warp every noise I use with a multi-directional just to, again, make sure it's somewhat it's following and understanding the shapes underneath. Some mid-tone greys, yellowy greys is my base, and I blend them on top of a monotone grey. Flat colour used for the stamp for the logo, and then use the original logo as just a mask. So these aren't blend. There's no blend layer going on. It's just stamped straight on with a mask. The yellow straps is again another cloud noise, directional warp, push through a gradient node, blend it back on top. Again, using the masks from my height blend down here. So yeah, this is the nice thing about height blends when I'm blending my stuff together is the masks they give you. When you're doing these types of materials, they're really useful. So like materials where you're sort of doing architecture type stuff, height blends, mask outputs are a godsend when you come to do the other elements. Because when you're doing like a natural material, you know, it doesn't really matter where the colours are a lot of the time. It's sort of quite generic noise over the top of each other. Whereas with something like this, you have to be very intentional with what you're doing. But yeah, so the grey material taken across. Pretty easy to blend back on top of each other for the metal, if I'm right. Insane. Oh, this is my roughness up here. I'm getting lost in my own graph. So the metal for the buckle is just a flat colour. Blend it back on top, again using a mask. So basically I wanted to punch up a little bit of, I don't want to call it stylized because it isn't stylized, but I like to sort of punch out the details. So I used a curvature node with a levels pass just to really punch them out, plug them into a gradient node, and I'd use a min darken on top. It just allows some of these details just to pop a little bit more. If you're doing something more sort of really realistic, you wouldn't do this. This is kind of just an extra step, just so that once the bags are shrunk down, all the details are still readable. I find when I don't do the curvature pass, it ends up with the details being lost when you start shrinking stuff. And then I do the same but inverted. Well, it's a dust node, but it's just basically an inverted curvature and ambient occlusion. But I take that, plug into a gradient node, blend it back on top, and it just sort of grounds everything together. So you can see the difference between this stage is actually quite important, really, because like before everything's just flat and you'd be completely reliant on your ambient occlusion to sort of tie all this together. But again, when you're shrinking stuff down, you can't always rely on that. So this stage just helps pull everything together. And then I histogram the original shape just to give me a mask output, so that when I go into the top layer graph, it's still, I've got a mask to output and use for blending stuff together. As for roughness, again, I basically take each element. So you can see this sort of broke up into elements. So here's my graphic, here's the straps, here's the buckle, and then these are sort of the detail passes at the end. So the roughness follows the exact same type of thing. Base, then a mask out for my straps, just make them a little bit more plasticky. Mask out again, make it a little bit darker for the metallic bit. And then using the detail passes just to help tie everything together. Again, one of the beauties of this type of thing is everything's broken up. It's quite a systematic approach when you build this type of stuff. So it's like the start, wrinkles, micro detail, the horizontal bout, the vertical bout, and the buckle. And then I can just take masks from each bit to create graphic, the bout, the buckle, and then like the micro details. So once you sort of understand the approach, it's quite systematic the way you go through these types of materials. I'm not going to walk through every graph for the bags. That's just a carbon copy of the previous one, just swapping the initial output and just fixing it up a little bit. This one's slightly different, I believe, because I think I have an additional bout. So you can see if I just click on view outputs. So there's a second strap. So what I've done differently is each one, the graphics in a slightly different place. This one has some sort of supporting straps. So like I said, the initial bit exact same. Horizontal bout, the vertical bout, I used the paraboid to directional warp just to give it sort of the outside curve because it's not center. And then again, I used 2 transform nodes. I probably should just use a mirror node. But apart from that, the initial shape stays the exact same, and everything I do is still the exact same. The supports, a lot of what you've already seen. It's some shapes which are sort of cut, trimmed, transformed, beveled, and then added some studs using a paraboid on top. And the fourth bag, again, I think it's the exact same, just the straps are in a slightly different position. View outputs in 3D. You see the straps are in a tight position, and why are you not previewing? View outputs in 3D. This designer being slow. Either way, you can see where the straps are different, and I'm just copying and pasting the first graph and just updating this, and it's quite a nice workflow, to be honest. It's a bit different because when I do like a normal material, you'd go back to this initial point, but it's still a lot of tweaking along the way. Whereas with these bags, it's like I could just change the input, and then I've got to tweak a couple of parameters just to position the straps in the correct way. So yeah, that's the sort of the bulk of the project was obviously these bags, and then it's bringing them all together. So if I go to view outputs, it's going to take a second. Right, near there, a couple more maps. Right, so here's my sort of final output, what I put together in this graph. You can see what I mean by the bags being shrunk down. You barely even see the buckles and the details within there. And also why I use stuff like the curvature pass. It does give it, I suppose, once you get into Marmoset, a slightly more stylized aesthetic. However, I prefer it just so I can read my details a little bit better. It's just, I think it's more of a personal preference thing. But here's my 4 graphs. I start with the height, and then everything else is sort of a copy of whatever I do here. So there's my 4 graphs, and literally all I end up doing is, if I grab another deep do I need deep? No, we can just look in the 2D view. I'm just transforming their position and positioning them into where I want them. This was a bit of sort of experimenting, because basically an issue I was having is I have 4 bags and I needed to make sure that the repetition weren't too noticeable. Obviously, you can see repetition, you know, this bag's here and here and here. But I had to make sure sort of they weren't above and below each other or next to each other. Because there's a few times where, you know, I just ended up with combinations which you just spotted there's the same exact bag next to each other, which obviously it doesn't look good. Yeah, I go through and position them. Ended up nudging them down and adding. I was originally going to do a 2x3, but I ended up doing 4x2. As you can see, like my sort of thinking process here is I've sort of made 3 and gone, that's not enough space, because I wanted them to tile horizontally, vertically. So I've gone, okay, I'll just sort of nudge these down and make room for another set of bags. Push them in a little bit just to allow room for the sides. But this bit here is quite useful, because basically what I do now is copy all of this for up here, for here, and basically what I'm doing is taking the input node from height to roughness on all of them, and it means that at the end I've got my roughness map, same for my metallic map, which is only on the buckles and the studs, and my albedo. Because I have the masks as well, if I needed them at this point, which I didn't, but I've got my, if I look at one of these, I've got all my outputs. I've got my roughness, my albedo, metallic, normal, AO, and my mask. So all I'm doing is just copying this whole section of the graph and just replugging it into whichever output I'm particularly working on. I need to make some side bits. Again, there's nothing particularly crazy going on. Some shapes which are transformed and positioned and mirrored to give me some sort of hard structures. There's not much detail in these, because basically I wanted this whole thing to be all about the bags. I don't want to have like crazy detail here which would detract from here. I've got this bolt node. I think I found it on Substance Source, but it's just quite a handy node. Rather than spending time creating some nice bolts, it's parameterized brilliantly. If I can find it, I'll link it in the description. But take a bolt and again, just transforming and shifting and positioning. So by this point, we've got my side pieces. Obviously, I have to do a quick albedo pass on them. I'm using just flat colors with the heights plugged in, just because these aren't like damaged or particularly dirty or worn, so everything's quite like sort of hyper polished, like you'd expect in space with this type of material. Like if I go back to the reference, like everything's very clean. Some dust in there, but overall the wear is very minimal. So that's why with my colour graphs, I'm not going to town on detail, and then I do the same again. I take a curvature, levels pass in, gradient it, and just blend it on top just to help these edges pop a little bit. Immediately it does give it a slightly stylized look, but you know, I'm okay with that. But piece it all together, blend it all together. I do a low pass just to help any tessellation. I don't know how, if I turn this down to it in 0, don't know how noticeable that was. Just makes these bottom bits a little bit smoother, so there's no less tearing. But that's the graph. Like it all the heavy lifting was done by Marvelous Designer, and I'm really glad I did this, because when you mess with Substance Designer for a while, you do want to sort of do everything in Designer, because it's sort of a technical exercise. But when I came to looking at this, I was sort of working out in my head, how do I tackle this problem? And I think I wouldn't have got the quality, or at least I wouldn't have got the quality in a reasonable amount of time that I wanted to achieve that sort of puffy bag style. And also it's just handy, you know, it gave me a good opportunity to learn Marvelous Designer, which I really appreciated. And it meant that it's sort of learning how to leverage the strengths of other software into each other, which is something like speaking to people on the podcast is sort of, it's been very interesting. People like Matthew O and Chris Radsby, they've spoke quite a lot about, you know, they will use different bits of modeling packages to leverage the strengths of each one. And with this material, I was trying to approach it the same sort of way. It was, I could do this all in Designer. It probably would have gave me a massive headache. Doing it in Marvelous just meant I had it done in half the time, and I managed to learn a couple of new skills. Yeah, I hope you guys find this useful and somewhat informative. I know there's probably no crazy tricks or anything being shown here. It's just a lot of repetition, and yeah, hopefully you understand how this material is put together, and you can put stuff together in a similar way using different bits of software. Thanks for listening, and remember to like, follow, subscribe. Really helps the channel. But thank you.